The man who came to kill Kate Easton arrived on a bay gelding with $100 in gold coins sewn into his saddlebag, and a promise of 400 more once the job was finished. And by the time he understood that he loved her, he was no longer certain he could bring himself to collect a single cent of it. Abraham Ramsey had ridden into the Wyoming territory in the spring of 1878, when the cottonwoods along the Sweetwater River were just beginning to bud, and the last of the winter snow still clung to the shadowed folds of the foothills. He had taken a room above the mercantile in the town of Larkspur, a settlement of perhaps 300 souls that existed mostly to serve the cattle ranches scattered across the wide basin, and he had waited there for 2 days before Silas Grant sent word that he was ready to meet. Grant kept an office above his own bank, a narrow room with a leather chair and a rifle mounted on the wall, and when Abraham stepped inside, Grant did not rise to greet him. He simply looked at him over steepled fingers, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache waxed to points and a diamond stickpin that caught the afternoon light. "You come highly recommended, Mr. Ramsey," Grant said. "The man in Cheyenne told me you have never failed to finish what you started." "I have not," Abraham said. It was true, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth even as he spoke them, because there had been a job in Nebraska 2 years before that had haunted him every night since, a man who had turned out to be innocent of the crime for which the bounty had been posted, and Abraham had learned that truth only after the man was already in the ground. "Good," Grant said. "Then you understand this must look like misfortune. A woman alone on a ranch in territory as wild as this meets with accidents every season, a fall from a horse, a fire in the night, renegades passing through. No one in this county will ask too many questions if Kate Easton simply disappears, so long as it is done with some care." Abraham had felt something tighten in his chest at the name, though he could not have said why, since he had never laid eyes on the woman. "Why does a widow with a small ranch trouble a man of your position, Mr. Grant?" Grant's eyes had gone flat and cold. "That is not part of our arrangement. You are being paid to solve a problem, not to understand it. There is land I require and a debt that must be settled, and a piece of paper that woman is not entitled to keep. Find it if you can, burn it if you cannot. But she must be gone by the first snow, or the $400 will find its way to a man less particular about the manner of doing things." It was that last threat, more than the money, that had decided Abraham. He had seen what men, less particular, did to lonely women on remote homesteads, had come across the aftermath of such work more than once in his years riding the territories, and something old and stubborn in him, some remnant of the man he had been before the war, had hollowed him out, told him that if this thing must be done, better it be done by a man who could at least look at himself in a shaving mirror afterward. He told himself that was the reason. He would learn, before the summer was through, that it was a lie he had needed to believe in order to ride out to her land at all. Kate Easton had buried her husband 8 months earlier on a hillside overlooking the ranch he had built with his own hands, a modest spread of 1,100 acres, along a bend of the Sweetwater that Daniel Easton had claimed under the Homestead Act 6 years before, back when the whole territory had seemed like nothing but grass and sky and possibility. Daniel had been thrown from his horse, or so the coroner in Larkspur had ruled, his neck broken in a ravine 2 miles from the house, and Kate had wept over him in a way she had not known her body was capable of weeping. And then she had gotten up the next morning and done the milking, because the cattle did not know that her husband was dead and did not care. She was 27 years old that spring, a tall woman with dark auburn hair she wore in a braid down her back most days, strong through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with a directness in her gaze that unsettled men who expected softness from a widow. She kept a Winchester rifle by the door and a Colt revolver in a drawer of her husband's roll-top desk, and she had learned, in the months since Daniel's death, to use both without her hands shaking, because Otis Prout, the old ranch hand who had worked for Daniel since before the marriage, had taught her. saying a woman alone on the frontier who could not defend her own fence line would not remain a woman with a fence line for long. She did not entirely believe the coroner's ruling about Daniel's death, though she had told no one this except Otis, and even to him she had said it only once, on a night in February when the wind had howled around the house and she had not been able to sleep for thinking of it. Daniel had ridden that same trail through the ravine 100 times. He had broken that same gelding himself and trusted it with his life. And when they had found the horse, it had been standing calm not 30 yards from where Daniel lay, cropping grass as though nothing at all had happened, no sign of having bolted or stumbled or thrown a rider in fright. She had found the ledger 3 months after the funeral, tucked into a false bottom in the bottom drawer of Daniel's desk, a small leather book filled with his careful handwriting, dates and figures and names, and among the names was Sela's Grant's, again and again, alongside entries that made no sense to her at first and then, slowly, over weeks of turning them over in her mind, made a terrible kind of sense. Cattle that did not belong to Grant, driven onto his range and rebranded. Payments to the previous sheriff, a man named Tolliver who had left the county rather suddenly the autumn before. A notation, dated only weeks before Daniel's death, that read simply, "Whitfield family gone. G. Satisfied. Land open." Kate had not gone to the law with it. The new sheriff, Wyatt Coleman, was an honest man so far as she could tell, but he was also young and new to the post, and Grant owned half the businesses in Larkspur and most of the men who worked in them, and she had no proof beyond her husband's handwriting that any of it meant what she feared it meant. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right evidence, the right ally. In her more honest hours, alone in the house at night, she admitted to herself that she was also afraid, and that fear had kept the ledger hidden in a hat box on the top shelf of her wardrobe for months, a secret she carried like a stone in her chest. It was into this uneasy quiet that Abraham Ramsey rode, on a bright morning in April, leading a second horse loaded with modest belongings, and took up residence on the old Whitfield claim that bordered Kate Easton's land to the north. She saw the smoke from his chimney before she saw the man himself, a thin gray thread rising against the pale sky from the cabin that had stood empty since the Whitfields left the previous autumn, and something in her stomach turned over uneasily at the sight of it, because a new neighbor might mean anything at all in country where a woman alone had learned to expect the worst. She rode over the following afternoon, rifle resting across her saddle in plain sight, not because she meant to threaten him, but because she had long since stopped riding anywhere without it, and found a man perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired, with a weathered face that might have been handsome if it were not for a certain guardedness around the eyes, mending a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair since the Whitfields' departure. "You are on Easton land," she called from a distance, because that was not quite true. The fence marked the boundary well enough, but she wanted to see how he answered a challenge before she rode any closer. He straightened slowly, and she noted, with the part of her mind that never fully stopped assessing danger, that he kept his hands visible and away from the pistol at his hip. "I do not believe I am, ma'am. This fence has stood here longer than I have been alive or near enough. I am Abraham Ramsey. I have taken up the Whitfield claim." "Kate Easton," she said, not dismounting. "My husband and I share this fence line with whoever holds that claim." "I would know your intentions before I know your name, Mr. Ramsey, if it is all the same to you." Something flickered across his face at the word husband, so brief she nearly missed it, and later she would wonder whether it had been guilt or simply surprise, though at the time she read it only as caution. "My intentions are to raise a few head of cattle and keep to myself, Mrs. Easton. I have no interest in troubling my neighbors." "Then we shall get along fine," she said, and turned her horse, and did not look back to see him watching her go. He watched her a long while, in fact, until she had crested the low rise between their two properties and disappeared from sight, and he found that his hands, when he returned to his fence mending, were not entirely steady, though he could not have said whether it was the weight of what he had come to do or something else entirely that unsettled him. The weeks that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Abraham kept mostly to himself, as he had said he would, working the small herd of cattle he had purchased with Grant's advance money, mending the buildings the Whitfields had left in poor repair, and watching Kate Easton's ranch from a distance, telling himself he was studying her habits, the way she moved between the house and the barn, the hours she kept, the moments when she was most alone and most vulnerable. He told himself this was simply the work, the careful patience a man in his profession required before he acted, and for the first 2 weeks he almost believed it. It was a spring storm that changed the shape of things between them, a fierce squall that blew down out of the mountains on a night in early May with hail the size of knuckles and wind that tore at the roofs of both their properties. Abraham had been in his barn when it hit, securing his own animals, and through the driving rain he saw a section of Kate Easton's barn roof peel back like the lid of a tin, and beneath it, struggling against the wind to drag a frightened milk cow clear of the collapsing structure, was Kate herself, alone, with old Otis nowhere in sight, having ridden into Larkspur that afternoon for supplies and been caught by the storm before he could return. Abraham did not remember deciding to go to her. He simply found himself running through the rain and the hail with his hat gone and his shirt plastered to his back, and together they got the cow clear, and then held the remaining timbers of the roof long enough to keep the whole structure from coming down on the rest of the livestock, working in a silence broken only by the shriek of the wind and the occasional shouted instruction, until the worst of the storm passed as suddenly as it had come. They stood afterward in the wreckage of the barn's north corner, both soaked through and breathing hard, and Kate had looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something like the beginning of trust. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Ramsey," she said. "I do not know what I would have done had you not come." "Any neighbor would have done the same," he said, which was true, and also entirely beside the point of why he had come to that country in the first place, and the contradiction sat in him like a swallowed stone. "Come inside and dry yourself by the fire," she said. "I owe you coffee at the very least, and it is a poor sort of neighbor who lets a man catch his death after such a favor." He should have refused. Every instinct trained into him by years of hard work had taught him that a bounty hunter did well to keep his distance from the mark, to observe without becoming known, to remain a stranger so that, when the moment came, there would be no hesitation born of familiarity. But he found himself following her into the house anyway, ducking under the low doorframe, and sitting at her table while she built up the fire and set a pot of coffee to boil, and something in the small domestic warmth of the room, the quilt folded over the back of a chair, the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, undid something in him that he had thought long since hardened past undoing. "You lost your husband recently," he said, though he already knew this, had known it before he ever saw her face. Kate's hand stilled for a moment over the coffee pot. "This past autumn." "A fall from his horse, they say, though I confess I have never been entirely at peace with that account of things." She glanced at him, as though surprised at herself for saying so much to a stranger. "Forgive me. I do not know why I tell you that. I have hardly spoken it aloud to anyone but Otis." "There is no need to apologize," Abraham said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in a long while. "Grief does not always keep to a schedule of who deserves to hear it." She looked at him a long moment, something searching in her gaze, and then she said quietly, "You speak like a man who has known loss himself, Mr. Ramsey." He did not answer for a moment, and when he did, it was with more honesty than he had planned to offer. "I had a wife once, and a sister, both gone now, one to fever and one to men who did not deserve to draw breath in the same territory as her. I do not speak of it often." "I am sorry," Kate said, and she reached across the table briefly and touched the back of his hand, a small gesture over almost before it began. But he felt it long after she had withdrawn her fingers to pour the coffee, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He rode home that night through the mud and the last drizzle of the passing storm with his chest aching in a way he did not have a name for. And it was there, alone in the dark cabin that Silas Grant's money had purchased for him, that Abraham Ramsey first admitted to himself, in plain and unwelcome words, that he did not want to kill Kate Easton, and that he was no longer certain he could. The town of Larkspur held a spring social that year on the last Saturday of May, as it did most years, a gathering in the school hall with a fiddler brought in from Casper and tables groaning under the weight of every pie and cake the ranching wives could produce. And it was there that Kate Easton and Abraham Ramsey danced together for the first time, under the disapproving eye of half the widows in the county and the entirely approving eye of Otis Prout, who had taken to watching his employer's new neighbor with the calculating interest of a man who had buried his own wife 20 years before and understood better than most what loneliness could do to a person left too long without company. Kate had told herself she would not dance that night, had told Otis as much on the ride into town. But when Abraham Ramsey crossed the hall in his one good coat, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and asked her with a formality that struck her as almost endearing in a man who had wrestled a collapsing barn roof beside her not 3 weeks before, she found she did not have it in her to refuse. "You dance better than I expected of a cattleman," she said, as the fiddle carried them through a reel that left her slightly breathless. "My mother insisted on it back in Missouri, before the war took most of what we had," he said. "She said a man ought to know how to move gracefully through at least one part of his life, even if the rest of it was plain misery." And was the rest of it misery? He was quiet a moment, his hand warm at her waist, and she felt the shift in him even before he answered, some old weight settling over his features. "Some of it. I lost my father at Shiloh, and my mother did not long outlive the news of it. My sister and I were raised by an aunt in Kansas after that, and when the aunt passed, it was only the two of us, until she married a man who turned out poorly, and then it was only me." He did not elaborate further, and Kate, sensing the rawness beneath the words, did not press him, though she filed the grief away in her heart alongside her own, a kinship of losses that made her feel, for the first time since Daniel's death, that she was not the only person in that territory carrying a weight too heavy to set down. It was during that same dance, over Abraham's shoulder, that Kate caught sight of Silas Grant standing near the punch table, watching her with an expression that made the hair rise on the back of her neck, a look of calculation entirely unsuited to a country social. He had approached her twice in the month since Daniel's death, offering to buy her land at a price she knew to be far below its worth, and each time she had refused him, and each time something in his manner had grown colder, more insistent, as though her refusal offended him on some deeper level than mere business. "You have gone stiff as a fence post," Abraham murmured, following her gaze to where it rested. "Is that man troubling you?" "Silas Grant has wanted my land since before my husband was cold in the ground," Kate said, low so as not to be overheard. "He has made offers. I have refused them. I do not entirely trust his patience to hold." Abraham felt something cold settle in his stomach at the name, spoken so plainly from the mouth of the woman he had been paid to kill on that very man's order, and it took every ounce of discipline he possessed to keep his face neutral, to continue the dance as though the ground had not just shifted beneath his feet. He had known, of course, that Grant wanted her land. He had not fully reckoned, until that moment, watching her jaw set with a stubbornness he had come to admire more than he should have, what kind of woman he had agreed to erase from the world in exchange for $400. "Has he threatened you outright?" Abraham asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice and hoped she would take it for simple neighborly concern rather than the beginning of something closer to fear. "Not in so many words, but my husband kept a record of certain of Mr. Grant's business practices before he died, and I have sometimes wondered whether that record had something to do with the manner of his death." She glanced up at Abraham, and something in her face softened, as though she had surprised herself again with her own candor. "I do not know why I keep telling you these things, Mr. Ramsey. I have not spoken so freely to anyone in a very long time." "Perhaps," Abraham said, his voice rougher than he intended, "you have simply been waiting for someone willing to listen." She smiled at that, a real smile, the first he had seen from her that reached all the way to her eyes, and the fiddle music swelled around them. And for a moment Abraham Ramsey allowed himself to forget entirely why he had come to that territory, and simply existed in the warmth of her hand in his and the low hum of the hall around them. And it was the happiest he had been in more years than he cared to count. The summer months brought a deepening of whatever had begun between them, though neither spoke its name aloud for a long while. Abraham found reasons to ride to Kate's ranch nearly every week, to help with branding when Otis's aging knees would not allow him to keep pace with the calves, to repair a section of well housing that had begun to crumble, to simply sit on her porch in the long evenings and talk of small things: the weather, the price of beef in Cheyenne, the books she kept on a shelf in the parlor that had belonged to her mother. Kate found herself watching for him from her kitchen window in the mornings, found herself dressing with slightly more care on the days she expected him, found herself, one evening in July, admitting to Otis that she thought she might be falling in love with their new neighbor. "About time you noticed what the rest of us have seen for 2 months," Otis said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "That man looks at you the way my Martha's father used to look at her mother, back before either of them was gray. It is a rare thing to see in this country, where most folks marry for want of a second pair of hands rather than for love. You would be a fool to waste it on grief that cannot be undone. Daniel has only been gone 10 months, Otis. Daniel would not want you cold and alone until you followed him into the ground," Otis said, more gently. "He loved you too well for that, and I knew him longer than you did, remember. He would want you happy, Kate. There is no shame in it." She thought about those words often in the weeks that followed, turning them over in her mind while she worked, and found that they eased something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the funeral, a permission she had needed to hear from someone other than herself. But even as her heart opened toward Abraham Ramsey, a different unease was growing in him, one he could not confide to her, and it ate at him more each day that passed without action, because Silas Grant was not a patient man, and the first snow, however distant it seemed in the heat of a Wyoming July, was a deadline that drew closer with every week Abraham failed to report progress. Grant summoned him to Larkspur on a hot afternoon in late July, and Abraham rode in with a knot of dread in his stomach that had nothing to do with fear of the man himself, and everything to do with what he now understood he was being asked to do. "You have been on that claim 3 months," Grant said, without preamble, once Abraham had climbed the stairs to his office. "I have heard reports that you have been keeping company with the widow, rather more than a man in your line of work generally requires for his purposes. A man must maintain his cover, Mr. Grant. Sudden violence against a woman well liked in this county would draw more attention than either of us wants. I have been building her trust, learning her habits, waiting for the right moment." "You have been dancing with her at the school social," Grant said, his voice going flat and dangerous. "You have been mending her fences and branding her calves. That is not the behavior of a man building toward an ending, Mr. Ramsey. That is the behavior of a man who has lost his nerve, or worse, lost his head over a pretty face. I did not pay good money for a suitor. I paid for a solution." Abraham kept his face carefully still, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You will have your solution, Mr. Grant. I do not fail at what I am paid to do. But I will do it in my own time and my own manner, or you may find someone else to finish the job, and explain to whatever fool you hire next why the widow already suspects the man asking too many questions about her husband's ledger." That last was a gamble, a piece of information he should not have revealed he possessed, since Kate had told him of the ledger's existence only in the strictest confidence, but it served its purpose. Grant's eyes narrowed with new interest. She has spoken to you of a ledger. Abraham cursed himself inwardly even as he pressed forward, understanding that he had opened a door he could not now close. She mentioned it in passing. Said her husband kept records of certain business dealings. I did not press her on the details for fear of raising suspicion, but I intend to find where she keeps it and bring it to you before I finish the rest of my work. A man in your position would not want such a document surfacing in the wrong hands, even after the widow herself is no longer a concern. Grant studied him for a long moment, and Abraham held himself still under that scrutiny, feeling as though he balanced on the edge of a blade. Finally, Grant leaned back in his chair, apparently satisfied. You have until the harvest moon, Mr. Ramsey, not a day longer. Bring me that ledger, and see to it the widow troubles no one ever again, or I will send men who care nothing for cover stories and courting dances, and they will not be nearly so gentle about the manner of it as I have allowed you to be. Abraham rode back to his claim that evening with the weight of that deadline pressing on him like a physical thing, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he had perhaps 2 months to find a way to save the woman he loved from a fate he himself had been hired to deliver, without losing his own life or hers in the attempt. It was during those same weeks that Kate finally showed him the ledger. She had debated it for days, turning the decision over in her mind during the long hours of ranch work, weighing her growing trust in Abraham against the old caution that had kept the book hidden for so many months. But she had come to depend on his counsel in matters large and small, had come to value his steady judgment, and there was no one else in that territory she trusted enough to share the burden of what she suspected. She brought it to him on a quiet evening in early August, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with the small leather volume between them, and watched his face as he read through Daniel's careful handwriting, the columns of figures, the notations about rebranded cattle and payments to a sheriff who had since fled the county, and finally that last chilling entry about the Whitfield family. He must have discovered something Grant could not afford to have known, Kate said, her voice tight with an old grief made suddenly sharper. I believe that is why he died, Abraham. I have believed it for months, though I have had no one to say it to who would not think me mad with sorrow and looking for someone to blame. Abraham's hands were not quite steady as he closed the ledger, and he was grateful the dim lamplight hid whatever his face might have betrayed, because in that moment the full weight of his deception crashed over him with a force that nearly took his breath. He was sitting in the kitchen of a woman whose husband had very likely been murdered by the same man who now paid Abraham's own wages, a woman who trusted him more than anyone else in that country, a woman he had come to love with an intensity that frightened him, and he had not yet found the courage to tell her a single word of the truth. Kate, he said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply, some rawness she had not heard from him before. There is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago, and every day I have failed to say it has made the failure worse. But before he could find the words, before he could gather the courage to speak the confession that had been building in him for months, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from outside, more than one horse, moving fast, and Kate rose from the table with the quick instinct of a woman who had learned never to ignore the sound of riders approaching after dark. Through the window they saw torchlight, 3 men on horseback pulling up in the yard, and at the front of them, unmistakable even in the dim light, sat Jed Calloway, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation in that county for cruelty that Kate had heard whispered of more than once, a man everyone knew rode for Silas Grant. Mrs. Easton, Calloway called out, not troubling to dismount. Mr. Grant sends his regards and a final offer for your land. He says to tell you it is the last kindness he intends to extend, and that you would do well to consider it carefully for your own safety. Abraham had gone rigid beside her, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip, and Kate, glancing at him in the lamplight spilling through the doorway, saw an expression on his face that she could not quite name, something between fury and desperation, and she filed it away, uncertain what to make of it, as she stepped onto the porch to answer the threat herself. "You may tell Mr. Grant," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt, "that my answer has not changed and will not change, no matter how many men he sends to my yard after dark to deliver it. This is Easton land, bought and proved under the law, and I intend to die on it of old age, not before." Calloway laughed, an ugly sound. "That can be arranged either way, ma'am. Mr. Grant is a patient man, but his patience is not without its limits, as I understand you already have cause to know." His eyes flicked to Abraham, standing in the doorway behind her, and something passed across his face, a flicker of recognition that made Abraham's blood run cold, though Calloway said nothing more, only touched the brim of his hat in mocking courtesy and wheeled his horse back toward the road, his two companions following. Kate stood on the porch a long moment after the sound of hoofbeats faded, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed, and Abraham came up behind her and set his hands gently on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him without quite deciding to, grateful for the solid warmth of him against the fear still coursing through her. "You were about to tell me something," she said quietly, "before they came." Abraham closed his eyes, feeling the moment slip away from him, the courage he had summoned dissolving into a colder, more practical fear, that if he confessed everything now, in the immediate aftermath of Calloway's threat, she would believe herself surrounded on all sides by enemies, with nowhere left to turn, and might do something desperate, might flee the territory entirely, might refuse ever to trust him again at the very moment she most needed someone she could trust. "It can wait," he said, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. "Tonight you need rest, not more trouble poured on top of what has already come to your door. Let me stay in the barn tonight, keep watch, in case Calloway's men decide to return before dawn." Kate turned in his arms to look up at him, and for a moment he thought she might press him further, but exhaustion and fear had worn away at her, and she simply nodded and said, "Thank you, Abraham. I do not know how I would have borne this year without you beside me." Those words stayed with him long after she had gone inside to bar the doors, as he sat through the night in her barn with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark road for any sign of returning riders, and turning over in his mind the impossible tangle he had made of his own life. He loved her. That much was no longer in any doubt. And he had been sent to that country to kill her, and had instead spent the summer falling in love with her, and had now compounded his sin by lying to her at the very moment she had trusted him with her deepest fear. He resolved, sitting there in the dark, that he would tell her everything, and soon, before Grant's patience ran out entirely, before the harvest moon came and went and brought with it whatever violence Grant intended to visit upon her if Abraham himself did not act. But he would need a plan beyond mere confession, some way to protect her once the truth was known, some way to see Grant brought to justice for Daniel Easton's murder rather than simply escalating the danger to Kate's life. And so, in the days that followed, even as his affection for her deepened with every shared meal and every quiet evening on her porch, he began, in secret, to gather what evidence he could of Grant's crimes, hoping to build a case solid enough to bring to Sheriff Coleman before his deception was discovered by any means other than his own confession. It was a delicate, dangerous game, and it could not last. The discovery came, as such things often do, through a small and unexpected accident. In the second week of August, Kate rode to Abraham's cabin to bring him a basket of preserves she had put up from her garden, arriving earlier than he expected and finding him absent, out checking his cattle along the northern fence line. She let herself in to leave the basket on his table, as neighbors in that country often did for one another without ceremony, and it was there, on the table itself, half hidden beneath a stack of papers, that she saw the edge of a folded document that made her blood run cold the moment her eyes fell upon the words printed across its top. It was a bounty contract, formal and precise in its language, bearing Silas Grant's signature and a sum of $500, and though the target's name had been written in a hand she did not immediately recognize, there was no mistaking the description that followed, nor the small, damning phrase near the bottom that read for the removal of the widow Easton from her present holdings, by whatever means necessary, before the first snowfall. Kate stood frozen in the small cabin for a long moment, the basket of preserves forgotten at her feet, as the full weight of what she was reading settled over her like a physical blow. She thought at first that perhaps Abraham had discovered this document somehow, had perhaps intercepted it, was investigating it on her behalf just as she now understood he must have been investigating Grant's other crimes. But then her eye fell upon a second paper beneath the first, a letter in Grant's own hand, addressed directly to Abraham Ramsey, discussing terms of payment already rendered and payment still owed, referring to him not as an investigator or an ally, but as the man I have hired for this purpose, and any lingering hope Kate had clung to collapsed entirely. She left the cabin without the preserves, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage her horse's reins, and rode home in a daze that left her uncertain, later, how she had made the journey at all, her mind consumed entirely by a single, devastating thought. The man she loved, the man she had begun to imagine a future beside, had been sent to that country to end her life. Abraham returned to his cabin an hour later to find the basket of preserves overturned on his floor, the papers on his table disturbed, and understood immediately, with a sick lurch of his stomach, what had happened. He rode for Kate's ranch at a gallop, arriving just as the sun was beginning to set, and found Otis standing on the porch with a shotgun leveled at his chest before he had even dismounted. "She does not wish to see you," Otis said, his voice hard in a way Abraham had never heard from the old man before. "And if you have any decency left in you at all, you will turn that horse around and ride off this land before I decide decency is not a quality I much care to extend to a man who came here to murder her. Otis, please, let me speak to her. Let me explain. There is a rifle trained on you from the front window right now, Mr. Ramsey, or whatever your true name may be, and I would not test how steady her hand is tonight, grief and fury being what they are." Otis's eyes were hard, but there was something else beneath the anger, a sorrow that suggested he too had believed in the man Abraham had pretended to be, and felt the betrayal of that pretense keenly. "You will leave this land now, and you will not return, or so help me, old as I am, I will put a bullet in you myself before Grant's other men ever get the chance." Abraham looked past Otis to the window, and though he could not see her clearly in the fading light, he thought he glimpsed a pale shape at the glass, and something in his chest broke at the thought of the pain he must have caused her, the terror of believing herself hunted by the one person she had let close enough to trust. "Tell her," he said, his voice rough, "that everything I felt for her was true, whatever else I concealed. Tell her I never intended to harm her, not since the first week I came to know her, and that I have spent 2 months trying to find a way to stop Grant without losing her trust entirely, and that I have failed at that, and I am sorrier for it than I have words to say. Tell her I will not trouble her again unless she wishes it, but that I will not stop working to see Grant brought to justice for what he did to her husband, whether she ever forgives me or not." He turned his horse and rode away into the deepening dark, and Otis lowered the shotgun slowly, watching him go, and behind him at the window, Kate Easton stood with tears streaming silently down her face, her rifle still gripped tight in trembling hands, torn between a fury she had never known herself capable of, and a grief for the loss of something she had only just allowed herself to believe in. The days that followed were among the hardest Kate had known since Daniel's death, a strange doubled grief that mingled old loss with new betrayal, and she threw herself into ranch work with a grim intensity, rising before dawn and working until exhaustion each night, as though sufficient labor might crowd out the ache in her chest. She did not ride toward the Whitfield claim, And Abraham, true to his word, did not come to her, though Otis reported seeing him more than once at a distance, watching her ranch from the ridge line, as though standing guard even from afar. It was Otis, in the end, who first suggested that perhaps the matter deserved more consideration than raw fury allowed. "I do not excuse what he did," Otis said one evening, as they sat together on the porch in the gathering dusk. "Coming here under false pretense, letting you grow fond of him while concealing such a thing. It was a wrong thing to do, and I understand why you cannot easily forgive it. But I have watched that man 3 months now, Kate, and I have seen how he looks at you, and I do not believe a man capable of such feeling could have gone through with what he was paid to do. I believe, whatever brought him here, something changed in him along the way. And I believe, if Silas Grant truly murdered your husband, as that ledger suggests, you may need every ally you can find before this is finished, whatever your feelings toward the man himself." Kate said nothing for a long while, staring out over the darkening fields toward the ridge where she knew Abraham's cabin stood, its window sometimes glowing faint with lamplight in the distance. "He lied to me, Otis, for months. Every kindness, every gentle word, I do not know now which of it was true and which was simply the performance of a man doing a job." "Then ask him," Otis said simply. "You are not a woman who has ever shied from a hard question, Kate Easton. Ride up there and ask him plain, and watch his face while he answers, and trust your own judgment on what you see there. You have never yet been wrong about the character of a man, not in all the years I have known you." It took her 3 more days to work up the courage, 3 days of turning Otis's counsel over in her mind alongside the memory of Abraham's face in the lamplight of her kitchen, the rawness in his voice when he had said, "There is something I must tell you," moments before Calloway's arrival had interrupted whatever confession he had been building toward. She thought of the way he had held her on the porch after that confrontation, the steadiness of his hands, the barn where he had kept watch through the night rather than leave her unguarded, and she found she could not entirely reconcile those memories with the cold calculation of a hired killer completing an assignment. She rode to the Whitfield claim on a gray morning in late August, her rifle across her saddle as it had been on the day they first met, though this time she carried it less for protection against him than from long habit, and found him mending fence in nearly the same spot where she had first challenged him months before, as though the intervening season had folded back upon itself. He saw her coming and went very still, setting down his tools, and did not move to approach her, as though understanding that whatever happened next must be entirely her choice to make. "I want the truth," she said, without preamble, reining in a few yards from him. "All of it. Silas Grant hired you to kill me. I have read the contract with my own eyes. I want to know why you came here believing you would go through with such a thing, and I want to know why you did not." Abraham's throat worked for a moment before he could speak, and when he did, his voice was low and unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. "Grant hired me in April, before I ever laid eyes on you. He told me only that a widow held land he wanted, and that she must be gone before the first snow, and I told myself, God forgive me, that if such a thing must be done, better it be done by a man with some shred of conscience left than by whoever he would hire in my place. I believed, or told myself I believed, that I could carry out the task without becoming the sort of man I had seen do such work with cruelty and relish. I was wrong to believe it, and I understand now that I was wrong from the very beginning, but I did not understand it fully until I met you." "And then what?" Kate's voice was tight, controlled, though her hands trembled on the reins. "And then I could not do it," Abraham said, and something in his face broke open, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. "Not after that first storm, when I saw you fighting to save your barn alone in the rain, and something in me simply would not let me stand by and watch, let alone raise a hand against you. Every week I spent in your company made the task more impossible, not less. I told Grant I needed time, that I was building trust, gathering evidence. And some of that was true, Kate. I have spent months trying to gather proof of his crimes against your husband and the Whitfield family both, hoping to bring him to justice through the sheriff, rather than simply refusing the contract and leaving you to whoever he hired next. But I should have told you the truth from the moment I understood my own feelings for you, and my cowardice in delaying that confession is a fault I will carry the rest of my life, whatever you decide to do with it now. Kate sat her horse for a long moment, studying his face, searching for any sign of the calculation Otis had warned her a hired killer might still harbor beneath a convincing performance of remorse, and found instead only a naked, exhausted honesty that matched everything she had come, against her own better judgment, to believe about the man's character over the months of their acquaintance. "You should have told me," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "The moment you knew your feelings had changed, Abraham, every day you waited was a day you let me believe in something false." "I know it," he said. "I have no defense for it except that I was afraid, and fear made a coward of me in the one matter where I most needed courage. I am sorrier for that than I have ever been for anything in my life, Kate, and I understand if it is more than you can find your way to forgive." She was quiet a long moment, and then she said, "Lo, Grant still means to have my land." Calloway's threat was plain enough on that count, contract or no contract, hired killer or no hired killer standing in my yard falling in love with me instead of doing his job. A ghost of something that might, in a different circumstance, have been humor passed across her face, quickly suppressed. "If what you say is true, that you have been gathering evidence against him, I would see it, and I would have you tell me everything you know, because whatever has passed between us, I still have a ranch to protect and a husband's murder to answer for, and I cannot afford the luxury of sorting out my feelings toward you before I have dealt with the more immediate danger Silas Grant represents." "I will show you everything," Abraham said, relief and lingering grief mingling in his voice in equal measure. "And I will help you see him answer for what he did to Daniel, and to the Whitfields whatever it costs me, whether you ever find your way to forgiving me or not. That much I owe you, and I mean to see it paid in full." It was the beginning, though neither of them fully understood it yet, of a fragile new alliance that would, over the difficult weeks that followed, slowly rebuild itself into something stronger than the trust that had been broken, tempered now by honesty in a way their earlier courtship, built as it had been on concealment, had never quite achieved. Over the following 2 weeks, Abraham shared with Kate everything he had gathered in his months of secret investigation. Notes on Grant's dealings with the corrupt former Sheriff Tolliver, testimony he had quietly collected from 2 other homesteading families who had been pressured or threatened into selling their claims to Grant at prices far below fair value, and his own account of Grant's explicit instructions regarding her death, delivered in Grant's own office and witnessed, Abraham now realized with grim satisfaction, by no one but the 2 of them. Which meant Grant would surely deny it if confronted without harder proof. Together, they resolved to bring the matter to Sheriff Wyatt Coleman, though they debated long into several evenings how best to do so, without simply provoking Grant into more immediate and violent action before the law could intervene. It was Kate who finally suggested the plan that they settled upon, that Abraham would return to Grant claiming to have located the ledger and arranged its imminent recovery, buying enough time for Kate to ride to Larkspur and lay the full account before Sheriff Coleman, along with the ledger itself as physical evidence, while Otis remained at the ranch keeping watch in case Grant's patience broke before the sheriff could act. "It is dangerous for you," Kate said, the night before they meant to set the plan in motion, sitting across from him at her kitchen table much as they had on the night Calloway's men first came to her yard. "If Grant suspects even for a moment that you have turned against him, he will not hesitate to have you killed alongside me." "I have made my peace with that risk," Abraham said quietly. I would rather face it than continue living as the man who came to this country to end your life, and instead learned what it meant to actually live one of his own, for the first time since the war took everything else from me." He reached across the table, hesitant, and when she did not pull away, took her hand in his. "I love you, Kate Easton. I do not ask you to say it back, nor even to forgive me fully for the wrong I have done you, but I would have you know it plainly, whatever comes of tomorrow." Kate's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she did not answer him in words, not yet, the wound of his deception still too fresh for her to speak such feelings freely, even though she recognized their truth stirring in her own chest. But she did not withdraw her hand from his, and they sat together a long while in the lamplight, two people who had each lost so much already, bracing themselves for whatever danger the following day might bring. The plan began to unravel almost from its first hour. Abraham rode to Larkspur early the next morning to meet with Grant, intending to stall him with false promises of the ledger's imminent delivery while Kate made her way, by a longer and less obvious route, toward the sheriff's office with Otis riding beside her as escort. But Jed Calloway, it transpired, had grown suspicious of Abraham in the weeks since the confrontation at Kate's ranch, and had taken to watching the Whitfield claim from a distance more closely than Abraham had realized. And it was Calloway who spotted Kate and Otis riding toward town that same morning, and rode hard to warn Grant before Abraham had even finished delivering his carefully rehearsed lies. Grant's reaction, when Calloway burst into the office with news that the widow was riding openly for the sheriff, was immediate and cold. "You have played me for a fool, Mr. Ramsey," he said, rising from his chair with a fury that made Abraham's hand drift instinctively toward his pistol. "Months of dancing and fence-mending, and all the while you meant to betray our arrangement entirely." "There is no arrangement left to betray," Abraham said, drawing his pistol fully now, though he kept it lowered, unwilling to fire the first shot in a crowded building above a public street. "I will not stand by while you finish what you started with Daniel Easton, Grant. That much you should have understood the moment I told you I needed time." Grant's laugh was ugly, humorless. "Then you leave me no choice but to finish this myself, and see that neither of you lives to trouble me further." He shouted for Calloway and the other men waiting below, and in the chaos that followed, Abraham found himself fighting his way down the narrow staircase of the bank building, exchanging fire with two of Grant's hired men in the street outside, while townsfolk scattered for cover, and Sheriff Coleman, drawn by the sound of gunfire, came running from his office 3 doors down with his own weapon already drawn. Kate, still a half-mile outside of town when the shooting began, heard the distant reports and felt her blood turn to ice, understanding instantly and with terrible certainty what must be happening. She spurred her horse forward at a dangerous gallop, Otis close behind her shouting for her to slow down, and arrived at the edge of Larkspur just in time to see Abraham backed against the wall of the Mercantile, wounded in the shoulder, his pistol nearly empty, with Jed Calloway advancing on him with murder plain in his eyes and Grant himself standing in the street beyond, a rifle now in his hands, aimed not at Abraham but at the road where he clearly expected Kate herself to appear. "Grant!" Kate shouted, reining her horse hard and swinging down before it had even fully stopped, her own rifle already in her hands, a skill Otis had drilled into her through a full year of practice finally called upon in the moment that mattered most. "This ends now. Sheriff Coleman has the ledger and testimony besides, and half this town has just watched your men open fire in broad daylight. There is nowhere left for you to run from what you have done." Grant's rifle swung toward her, and for one terrible, suspended moment, Kate believed she was about to die in the street of the town where she had married Daniel Easton 6 years before. But Abraham, seeing the barrel turn toward her, threw himself forward with the last of his strength, tackling Grant from the side, and sending the shot meant for Kate harmlessly into the dirt of the street instead. The two men grappled in the dust, Abraham weakened by his wound, but fighting with a desperate strength born of pure terror at what he had nearly witnessed, until Sheriff Coleman arrived at a run and pressed the barrel of his own revolver against the back of Grant's skull, ending the struggle with a single sharp command to yield. Calloway, seeing his employer overpowered and understanding the fight was lost, dropped his weapon and raised his hands, and the other two hired men, watching from further down the street, wisely chose to do the same rather than face the gathering crowd of armed townsfolk who had emerged from the buildings along the main street, drawn by the gunfire, and now standing witness to Grant's downfall. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun, though the aftermath stretched through the remainder of that long day. Statements taken by Sheriff Coleman from every witness, the ledger examined and cross-referenced with records the sheriff himself was able to obtain from the county land office confirming the fraudulent transfers of the Whitfield claim and two others. And finally, as evening fell over Larkspur, Silas Grant led away in irons to await the circuit judge's arrival the following month, his empire of intimidation and theft unraveling in a single afternoon. Kate knelt beside Abraham in the dust of the street through much of that chaos, pressing her own scarf against the wound in his shoulder to slow the bleeding until the town's doctor could be fetched. And though her hands were steady with the practiced calm of a ranch woman accustomed to tending injuries, her voice, when she spoke to him, was thick with an emotion she no longer troubled to hide. "You threw yourself in front of a rifle for me," she said, half accusation, half wonder. "I told you I loved you," Abraham said, his voice weak but steady, a faint smile touching his lips despite the pain. "I did not say so merely to hear the sound of the words." "You are a fool, Abraham Ramsey," she said, though there were tears on her cheeks now, and she pressed her forehead briefly against his uninjured shoulder, careless of the blood and the dust and the gathered crowd watching them both with undisguised interest. "A fool, and I believe I love you regardless. God help me for it." The doctor arrived shortly after and pronounced the wound serious but not mortal, the bullet having passed through the meat of the shoulder without striking bone, and Abraham was carried to a bed at the town's small boarding house to recover under Kate's watchful and near-constant attention over the following 2 weeks, a period during which whatever remained of the old wound of his deception finally began to heal alongside the physical injury, as they talked through long afternoons of everything that had passed between them, and everything they hoped might yet come. Silas Grant stood trial before the circuit judge in Larkspur that September, and the evidence against him proved overwhelming. The ledger detailing his cattle rustling and bribery, testimony from the Whitfield family, who returned from Casper where they had fled to give their account of the intimidation that had driven them from their land, and Abraham's own testimony regarding the contract Grant had signed to arrange Kate's death. The physical document itself entered as evidence despite Grant's furious insistence that it had been forged. The jury, drawn from among Larkspur's own citizens, many of whom had suffered under Grant's economic dominance for years without daring to speak against him, took less than an hour to return a verdict of guilty on charges of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to the murder of Daniel Easton, a charge the prosecution was able to establish through testimony from a former ranch hand of Grant's who came forward, once Grant's power was broken, to admit he had witnessed Grant order Daniel's horse spooked, and Daniel himself struck from behind before being thrown into the ravine to make his death appear an accident. Grant was sentenced to hang the following spring, a sentence that was, in the fullness of time, carried out at the territorial prison in Cheyenne, bringing a final and complete measure of justice to Daniel Easton's memory that Kate had scarcely dared to hope she would live to see. Jed Calloway, having cooperated with the sheriff's investigation once his employer's fortunes collapsed, received a lighter sentence of several years' imprisonment for his part in the threats and violence carried out on Grant's behalf, while the other hired men, minor participants in the scheme, were released after brief detention with stern warnings from Sheriff Coleman that Larkspur would not tolerate their return. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late October, weeks before the deadline Grant had once set for Kate Easton's death. And by then Abraham had fully recovered from his wound and moved his few remaining cattle onto Kate's land at her invitation. The two ranches functionally combined under an arrangement that satisfied both practicality and a deepening devotion neither of them any longer troubled to conceal from Otis or from the town, which had, in the wake of Grant's downfall, come to regard Abraham Ramsey as something of a local hero for his role in exposing the man's crimes, whatever quiet complications had first brought him to that country. He asked her to marry him on Christmas Eve, in the same kitchen where he had first confessed his growing feelings for her, and where, months later, she had first discovered the terrible truth of why he had come to her land at all, and it seemed to both of them a fitting place for the circle to close. He had no ring to offer her that night, only a small band of silver he had fashioned himself from a coin, working the metal by lamplight over several evenings while she slept, unaware, in the next room. And when he presented it to her, kneeling on the worn floorboards of the kitchen with snow falling thick and silent outside the window, Kate wept freely for the first time since her husband's funeral. Tears that carried in them both the last of an old grief finally settling into peace and the beginning of a joy she had not believed herself capable of feeling again. "I loved Daniel Easton with my whole heart," she told him, holding his face in her two hands, "and I will carry that love with me all my life, a part of who I am that I would not wish undone even if I could. But I love you too, Abraham Ramsey, differently perhaps, forged in fire and lies, and then rebuilt from something more honest than either of us knew how to offer at the start. And I would be glad, more glad than I have words to say, to become your wife." They married in the small church at Larkspur the following spring, in April, almost exactly a year after Abraham had first ridden into that country with murder in his contract and doubt already stirring, unacknowledged, somewhere beneath his ribs. Otis gave the bride away, standing in for the father she had lost years before, and wept openly through the ceremony despite his gruff protests that it was only the wind irritating his eyes. And the whole town turned out for the celebration that followed, a measure of how thoroughly Larkspur had come to embrace both the widow who had stood firm against Silas Grant's tyranny and the bounty hunter who had, in the end, chosen love and justice over the blood money that had first brought him to her door. They built a life together on the combined ranch over the years that followed, expanding the herd, repairing and enlarging the house to make room for the family they hoped to raise, and acknowledging, in quieter moments together, the hard truths of the country they had built their happiness within, the land that had once belonged to tribes pushed from it before either of their families arrived. The Whitfields and others like them who had suffered under men like Grant before justice finally found its way to punishing such crimes, and the fragile nature of law and safety on a frontier where a woman alone had needed a rifle by her door and a bounty hunter had once nearly been paid to end her life rather than protect it. They spoke of these things sometimes on quiet evenings and resolved in their own small way to run their ranch with a fairness and generosity that stood in deliberate contrast to the greed that had cost Daniel Easton his life, hiring fairly, paying fairly, and lending aid to any neighbor who fell on hard times, as Abraham himself had once been given an unlikely chance at redemption he had not entirely deserved, but had earned through the honest changing of his own heart. Their first child, a son, was born in the winter of 1880, and they named him Daniel, after the husband Kate had lost, a decision Abraham himself suggested without a trace of jealousy, understanding better than most the weight and value of honoring the dead even while building new life among the living. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Martha after Otis's own late wife, much to the old man's tearful delight, and by the time the youngest of their eventual 4 children arrived, a second son born in 1886 whom they named simply for Otis himself, the old ranch hand had become less an employee than a grandfather in all but blood. spoiling each child in turn with a fondness that made Kate laugh and shake her head and Abraham smile with a contentment he had never expected to find in the years before he rode into that country with a bounty contract folded against his chest. Otis Prout lived to see all four of the children grown past their early years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1894 at the age of 71, mourned deeply by the family he had helped hold together through its most dangerous season, and buried on the hillside overlooking the ranch not far from where Daniel Easton himself rested. Two men who had each, in their own way, loved and protected the same remarkable woman. Abraham Ramsey never again took up the trade of bounty hunting after that first and only assignment in Wyoming territory, choosing instead to devote himself entirely to the ranch and to the family he built with Kate, though he did, on more than one occasion in later years, assist Sheriff Coleman and his successors in tracking down genuine criminals who passed through the county, his particular skills proving useful when turned toward honest justice rather than the cold transactions of contracted violence. He told his children, when they were old enough to understand it, the full and unvarnished truth of how he had come to their mother's land, holding nothing back, believing that they deserved to know the whole of it rather than some polished version scrubbed clean of its darker beginnings, and each of them, in turn, came to understand the story not as a tale of a father's shame, but as proof of what a person could become when given the chance to choose love and honesty over the easier path of following through with a wrong once begun. Kate Easton Ramsey lived to a contented old age on the ranch that bore witness to both the worst and the best of what had passed between her and the man she married, and in her final years, sitting on the porch of the house they had built and expanded together, watching grandchildren chase each other through fields that had once nearly cost her everything, she would sometimes tell the story of how her second husband had come to her as a stranger with murder folded into his saddlebag, and had left, in the fullness of time, as the truest partner she had ever known, a man who had found in her not merely a target to be studied and eliminated but a reason, after years of grief and hardened purpose, to remember what it meant to hope for something better, and to fight, at the risk of his own life, to protect it. The Wyoming wind still moved across that valley each spring the same as it always had, carrying the scent of new grass and the promise of another season's calving, indifferent as ever to the small dramas of the people who lived beneath its endless sky. But on the Ramsey Ranch, in the house where Kate and Abraham raised their children and grew old together, the story of how they found each other was told and retold through the years as proof that even a beginning built on deception and danger could, through honesty freely chosen and courage tested in the fire of real consequence, be transformed into something as solid and enduring as the land itself.